mentioned many times that the characterisation of magicians as Satanists is something of a myth created by the Abrahamic religions during the Middle Ages. Indeed, at the broadest level, I doubt if Satanism really exists. That's not to say that a very small number of magicians do not invoke Satan, even worship him, but this is informed and shaped by their Abrahamic beliefs. This highlights an important tension within my broad-brushed historicism and its potential contradictions by detail. But the aim of this vlog is to point at how beliefs are constructed, rather than detailed seeming contradictions. So what is this vlog about? Well, it's my contention is that the practice of magic, and I'm not restricting this to the Western magical tradition, has been shaped, maybe even formed, by the Abrahamic religions. The starting point for this is how notions of God, the devil, heaven, hell, good and evil, angels and demons, are more products of the established Abrahamic religions, attempting to introduce fear into their congregations. More so that traditions which can be traced back to man's earliest beliefs and practices. Indeed, the very notion of notions of polytheism, paganism, magic, are as much constructs of the Abrahamic religions as an objective description of the past. It's often argued that magic is simply other people's religion. There are many examples how mystical practices within the Abrahamic religions were suppressed as being polytheistic or pagan. But all religions contain their own mystical beliefs and ceremony, which others might construe as magic. Certainly in ancient times, magic was used in ritual and medicine and to counteract evil omens. Defensive or legitimate magic in Mesopotamia, Asiuptu or Masumasutu, were incantations and ritual practices intended to alter specific realities. The ancient Mesopotamians believed magic to be a viable defence against demons, ghosts and evil sorcerers. To defend themselves against spirits of those they had wronged, they would leave offerings known as kispu in a person's tomb in the hope of appeasing them. The ancient Mesopotamians also believed that the underworld, or Kur, was home to many demons, which are sometimes called the offspring of Arali. These demons could leave the underworld and terrorise mortals on earth. But ancient Mesopotamians made no distinction between rational science and magic. When a person became ill, doctors would prescribe both magical formulas to be recited as well as medical treatments. Furthermore, it was very much a part of their religious tradition. This points to an important element of my argument, that we confuse magic with technology and religion of the ancients from our 21st century belief system, which is largely informed by the Abrahamic religions. Thus we assume that the deities of the Greeks and Romans are gods, but their worship and purpose had more in common with our superstitions than actual religion. A large number of magical papyri in Greek, Coptic and Demotic have been recovered. They contain early instances of the use of magic words said to have power to command spirits, the use of mysterious symbols or sigils, which are thought to be very useful when invoking or evoking spirits. Again, magic was not separate from religion. It later became associated with the more transgressive aspects of it. The practice of magic was banned in late Roman world, and in the Codex Thessalonicenses of 438, it brought together Christian approaches to the law. Indeed, the Codex is what informed the medieval Abrahamic's characterisation of evil. This potential misinterpretation is carried forward in our interpretation of, for example, what we see as Celtic deity. For example, in Welsh literature, what we assume are deities are never mentioned as being this, but simply as historic figures, suggesting that oral traditions of the past are being reinterpreted via an Abrahamic veneer. Ancient Egypt is even more contentious. Whilst we can see elements of what we might consider to be magic, these are inextricably linked with religious beliefs. Certainly there's no mention of demons, little mention of demons within the Egyptian tradition. That's not to say that amulets and spells were not commonplace amongst the priesthood and common Egyptians, but there is no sense that this is somehow transgressive. The Christian view was that magic was a product of the Babylonians, Persians or Egyptians. The Christians shared with earlier classical culture the idea that magic was something distinct from proper religion, although drew their distinction between the two in different ways. Christian ideas of magic were closely linked to Christian categorization of paganism, and both magic and paganism were regarded as belonging under the broader category of superstition. But the definition of superstition is so value-laden that it must be unmodern and transgressive simply because it conflicts with the doctrines of the Church. Today we've substituted science and logic for religious teachings, with the implication being even more vociferous. How else can one explain the outright hostility some have towards superstitions and magic? Augustine of Hippo suggests that magic did not merely constitute fraudulent and unsanctioned ritual practices, but was the very opposite of religion because it relied upon cooperation from demons, the henchmen of Satan. Thus Christian ideas of magic were closely linked to the Christian category of paganism. The Christian emphasis on inherent immorality and wrongness of magic as something conflicting with good religion was far starker than the approach of Judaism and Islam during the Middle Ages. For instance, Christians regarded demons as inherently evil. The jinn were perceived as more ambivalent figures, neither good nor evil, by Muslims. Such Christian thinking has now influenced Islam, and a minority of Muslims would follow this medieval Christian tradition, including the idea that magic is associated with paganism or pre-Islamic beliefs, defining all jinn as evil, that we should not engage with them. But if we do, if they do with us, we should convert them to Islam, even kill them. The model of the magician in Christian thought was provided by Simon Magus, Simon the Magician, a figure who opposed St. Peter in both Acts of the Apostles and the apocryphal yet influential Acts of Peter. Medieval Europe, and indeed the Middle East, also saw magic to be associated with the Old Testament figure of Solomon. Various grimoire or books outlining magical practices were written that claimed to have been written by Solomon, most notably the Keys of Solomon. In medieval Europe, Christians also suspected Muslims and Jews of engaging in magical practices. In certain cases, these perceived magical rites included the alleged Jewish sacrifice of Christian children, resulting in Christian massacres of these religious minorities. Christian groups also accused other rival Christian groups, which they alleged as being heretical, of engaging in magical activities. But of course this continues today, with non-Protestant Christians and Muslims being accused of Satanism. Whilst in Saudi Arabia, the anti-witchcraft unit of the Committee of the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice Police persecute and indeed sentence to death non-Wahhabi Muslims. Thus, a range of customs and practices, such as divination and veneration of spirits, are defined as sihir, or sorcery, which in turn is claimed to be a form of shirk, or polytheism, the most serious sin of idolatry. A line of argument which, until researching this, I was unaware of being influenced by the rabbinical tradition. Medieval Europe also saw the term maleficenium applied to forms of magic that were conducted with the intention of causing harm. In 1487, Kramer published the notorious Malleus Maleficarium, Hammer Against the Evildoers, which gave rise to the witch hunts of the early modern era. Although the persecution of wretches, especially in Central Europe, can be found within the medieval era itself. The medieval Western magical tradition is almost exclusively associated with demonology, despite magic in the Islamic world having developed well beyond jinn magic. Whilst it could be argued, and so often is, that these demons are derived from Mesopotamian gods, the main source comes from King Solomon. Certainly any entity which is venerated will have some power, so modern magicians do claim to invoke Sumerian gods. Rabbinical tradition attributes the Book of Wisdom, including the Septuagint, to Solomon, although this book was probably written in the 2nd century BCE. The Gnostic Apocalypse of Adam, which may date to the 1st or 2nd century, refers to a legend in which Solomon sends out an army of demons to seek a virgin who had fled from him. This tradition of Solomon's control over demons appears to be fully elaborated in the Testament of Solomon with its demonology. This was written in Greek based on precedents dating back to the early 1st century millennium BCE, but it is probably not completed until the Middle Ages. In the Bible, Solomon is primarily described in 2 Samuel, 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. The biblical narrative disapproves of that Solomon permitted his foreign wives to import their national deities, building temples to Ashtoreth and Milcom. The Adamic tradition links demons to the fall of man, caused by the serpent who beguiled Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Thus the Adamic story traces the source of evil to Satan's transgression and the fall of man reflected in the book of Adam and Eve, which explains the reason for Satan's demotion by his refusal to worship and submit to God. The Enochian tradition links demons to the fall of angels in the antediluvian period. This tradition bases its understanding of the origins of demons to the story of the fallen watchers by Azazel. While the beginning of their conceptual journeys, Azazel and Satan are posited as representatives of 2 distinct and often rival trends. Al-Quran claims that Solomon had great wisdom, knowledge and power. He knew the language of birds. Solomon was also known in Islam to have other supernatural abilities bestowed on him by Allah, like controlling the wind, ruling the jinn, and hearing the communication of ants. However, Al-Quran suggests that Solomon's transgressions were actually the work of a jinn posing as Solomon. In the Testament of Solomon, demons are of Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, Christian, Arabic, and indeed other traditions. The majority of the Testament consists of Solomon's interviews with the demons. Based on the Testament of Solomon, the Lesser Keys of Solomon is also known as Lemegetus Cavilus Salomonis. It is an anonymously authored grimoire on demonology. It was completed in the mid-17th century, mostly from material several centuries older. It's divided into 5 books: Ars Goetia, Ars Theurgia Goetia, Ars Polinia, Ars Alamandel, and Ars Notoria. The demon names taken from Ars Goetia differ in terms of number and ranking from the commonly used Weyas, Pseudomonarchia, Daemonia, which contains 72 demons. Although Islam retains a belief in jinn, lists and hierarchies of jinn can very much resemble Pseudomonarchia, Daemonon. Claudio Rocchetti has convincingly argued that Western magical tradition is more informed by the practice of exorcism than traditional magical practices. Whilst I do recognise some differences to the Islamic world, I do also believe that Ruqya also informs the practice of magic, and indeed the accusations of the anti-witchcraft unit inform the practice of sorcery within the Middle East. As I've indicated, the mid and latter medieval practice of magic is almost exclusively associated with demonology rather than traditional, or I might say other magical practices. But if we look towards the animistic tradition, we can identify the use of natural substances for paranormal, maybe I should say sympathetic purposes, including divination. This is a tradition I am all too aware of within the Javanese context. The other tradition is that of ancestor veneration, who can be used to support their petitioners. This can also incorporate elements of necromancy, which begin to merge with demonology, but it's difficult to assess where they began to merge. And nevertheless, such animistic practices are very much seen as a technology and only become defined as magic by the Abrahamic religions. The sworn book of Honorius, Liber Juratus Honori, is a medieval grimoire purportedly to be written by Honorius of Thebes. The sworn book is supposedly the product of a conference of magicians who decided to condense all their knowledge into one volume. It is something of a diatribe against the Catholic Church, suggesting that their suppression of magic was itself demonic. In its 93 chapters, it covers a large variety of topics, from how to save one's soul from purgatory to catching thieves or finding treasure. It has many instructions how to conjure and command demons, to work with other magical operations, and knowledge of what lies in heaven, amongst other highly sought after information. The sworn book certainly influenced my hero Sir John Dee in his development of Enochian or angel magic. Prior to the suppression of magic, Pope John the 22nd, it would seem that to have been much more tolerated within Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Indeed, especially in Catalonia in southern France, such magic developed as a part of religious beliefs, especially linked to religious doctrine. Thus, for example, Shams al-Marif's focus is on the use of divine names of Allah, using magic squares, no matter how many vlogs appear on this channel claiming it to be something completely different. Such magical practices include incantations, divination, astrology, alchemy, physiognomy, talismans, numerology, gematria and cartomancy. Although I have to mention angel magic, which does begin to merge with demonology. Indeed, within Islamic magic, certain jinn are seen as supporting angels in bringing balance to the universe. Returning to Honorius of Thebes, maybe his point that suppressing of magic by the Abrahamic religions is itself demonic is worth exploring. At its most basic version, we can characterise the suppression of magic as an attempt to monopolise the practice of magic. The religious authorities would claim their ceremonies and miracles are divine and anything but magic. But at a logical level, this only seems to support the argument that they are monopolising magic. But at least the Western magical tradition appears to be informed by Abrahamic religions. Then maybe Honorius has a point. Perhaps the most important part of this argument is that prior to the suppression, magical practice was much more varied, and indeed often linked to religious doctrine. But once lists and hierarchies of prescribed demons were published, it became almost exclusively concerned with demonology, to such an extent that even Sir John Dee's Enochian magic has become defined as transgressive. At a more esoteric level, I've often argued that black magic is the imposition of one's will on others. How else should we characterise the suppression, often brutal, of magic by Abrahamic religious authorities? Indeed, the impression of magic that so many hold seem to be informed by our deepest fears that have been stoked, if not created, by Abrahamic religious authorities. But my real concern is that in using a broad brush definition of all magic as transgressive, it includes my own mystical beliefs. For me and many mystics, the goal of magic is to bring one closer to God and to suppress the ego. We call this high magic, rather than world material benefits. Indeed, this was the real aim of Liber Jurata Sonari, or at least the Beatific vision, a tradition which is completely ignored, even denied by the religious zealots. Hence my greatest concern is that such condemnation actually prevents the religiously devout from what I would consider to be the whole point of religion. And whilst I don't believe this condemnation to originate with demons, I certainly see it to be so ill-informed to be almost evil.